The vault beneath the pines. The garage smelled like motor oil and someone else's life. Harlan Morse sat on the concrete floor with his back against the cold drywall and his toolbox across his knees. Not because there was nowhere else to sit. There was a perfectly good chair 3 feet away, a folding lawn chair with a faded pattern that his daughter Sylvia had set up near the water heater. But Harlan didn't sit in it. He hadn't sat in it once in the 4 months they'd been living here. He sat on the floor because the floor was honest. The floor didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Outside through the thin wall, he could hear the neighborhood going about its business. A lawnmower 2 houses down, a dog that had been barking since sunrise and hadn't found a reason to stop. The muffled sound of Sylvia's television through the door that connected the garage to the house, always on, always loud, filling every silence before a silence could ask a question. Edna was asleep on the air mattress in the corner. She slept more than she used to. Not from laziness. Edna had never been lazy a day in her life, not in 37 years of double shifts and overnight call-ins and holidays spent on hospital floors instead of at kitchen tables. She slept because when you are 71 years old and the world has taken most of what you built, sleep is the one place nobody can follow you. Harlan watched her breathe. Her hair had gone fully white in the last 2 years. He wasn't sure exactly when that happened. It felt like one morning he looked up and it was just done the way a season changes, not all at once, but suddenly undeniable. He noticed it the way he noticed everything about Edna quietly, without making a production of it, the way a man notices the details of something he has loved for so long that looking at it feels like breathing. His right hand rested on the lid of the toolbox. It was trembling. Not violently, not the kind of trembling that makes people look away or offer unnecessary help. Just a fine, persistent vibration, like something running too hard for too long and now carrying a frequency it couldn't quite shake. The stroke had done that 18 months ago. A small one, the doctor said. As strokes went, he'd been lucky. His speech was intact. His mind was intact. Only his hands had changed, and for a man who had spent 4 decades with his hands inside machines, who had learned to feel the difference between a cylinder that needed 30 foot-pounds and one that needed 32 without looking at a gauge for that man, the trembling was not a small thing. He opened the toolbox and looked at what was inside. A half-inch drive ratchet, a set of combination wrenches he'd bought in 1987 and sharpened twice since, a wire brush worn down to nearly nothing, a flashlight with a cracked lens that still worked if you held it at the right angle, a folded piece of cloth he used to check dipsticks. These were the things he'd kept when they sold the house. These and nothing else from the garage, because everything else had been part of a life that had ended, and he was not the kind of man who held on to things as monuments to what used to be. He closed the toolbox. He sat with it on his lap and listened to the lawnmower and the bomb and Sylvia's television, and he did not think about the house on Dunmore Street where he and Edna had lived for 26 years. He did not think about the oak tree in the front yard that he'd planted the year their youngest was born. He did not think about the vegetable garden Edna kept along the south fence, the one she'd started the summer they paid off the mortgage, and celebrated with a bottle of wine neither of them could quite finish because they were tired and happy, and that was enough. He didn't think about any of that. He had learned not to. What he thought about instead was engines. 40 years of engines had taught Harlan Morse one fundamental truth about the world, a truth more reliable than anything he'd read in a book or heard from a preacher or absorbed from the particular brand of received wisdom that gets passed down through families like furniture nobody quite wants but can't bring themselves to throw out. The truth was this: everything that breaks has a reason. Every failed bearing, every blown gasket, every cracked block. There is always a cause, always a sequence of events that led to the moment of failure. And if you are patient enough and honest enough and willing to look where the problem actually is rather than where you'd prefer it to be, you can find it. He had applied this principle to engines for 4 decades. He had not applied it to his family quickly enough. That was the thing he sat with on the concrete floor of his daughter's garage. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Not anger, though that was there too. Lower down like a pilot light that never quite went out. What he sat with was something closer to the feeling he got when a customer brought in a car that had been neglected for years, a slow, thorough, slightly sick recognition of how long the damage had been accumulating before anyone decided it was worth looking at. Harlan and Edna had raised 4 children in the house on Dunmore Street. Sylvia was the oldest. She had been a serious child, good in school, careful with her choices, the kind of daughter who made her parents feel they had done something right. She had married a man named Mark Hadley when she was 28, and Mark was the kind of man who wore confidence, like a second skin, who always had a plan and always had an angle, and who had looked at Harlan and Edna's modest savings and their paid-off house and seen not family, but an underutilized asset. Harlan had not seen it at the time. He had seen a man who made his daughter laugh, and that had been enough. It was Mark who first said it. At a family dinner years ago, passing the breadbasket, voice so casual it barely registered. You two should really think about putting that equity to work. Money sitting in a house isn't doing anything. Harlan had nodded and changed the subject. He should have set down his fork and said something that would have mattered. He didn't. That was his part in what came later, the part he could not give back. Sylvia had absorbed her husband's perspective the way people absorb the perspectives of those they love, gradually, without noticing, until one day the borrowed idea fits so well it feels original. She had not started out calculating. Harlan believed that had to believe it because the alternative was that the girl who used to bring him coffee in the shop on Saturday mornings had never been who he thought she was, and that particular revision of history was one he was not willing to make. What he was willing to believe was that the marriage had changed something in her, had slowly replaced the version of Sylvia, who understood that her parents were people with a history of their own, with a version who understood them primarily as a resource with a balance. Boyd was the second child and the loudest. He had his father's build and none of his patience. Where Harlan approached problems methodically, Boyd approached them the way a man approaches a door he wants open with force, and then more force, and then frustration. That force hadn't worked. He had borrowed money from his parents 3 times before the stroke, each time with a reason that sounded reasonable enough in the moment, each time with a promise to repay that evaporated before the check cleared. Boyd had learned from watching Sylvia that their parents would eventually say yes, and he had built his financial life around that assumption, the way some people build their lives around assumptions that are eventually withdrawn without warning. Colleen was the third child and the quiet one. Not quiet like Harlan, whose silence was a form of attention. Quiet like a person who has decided it is safer not to be noticed, who has learned that going along costs less than standing apart. She was not cruel by nature. She was something more complicated and ultimately more disappointing. She was a person who knew the difference between right and wrong and consistently carefully chose not to act on that knowledge when acting would have cost her something. She had watched her siblings take and had said nothing, not because she agreed, but because disagreement required courage she had never fully developed, and silence had always seemed like the path that preserved the most. Leland was the youngest, and for a long time Harlan had believed Leland was simply too young to understand what was happening. He had told himself this the way parents tell themselves the things they need to believe. Leland had been present at some of the family conversations, had sat at the table while his older siblings made their cases and his parents slowly agreed to things they could not afford to agree to, had said nothing, had looked at his plate. Harlan had told himself his youngest son hadn't understood. He understood now that Leland had understood everything. The money went in stages. The first stage was the house itself, which they sold at Sylvia's urging. 18 months after the stroke, when it became clear that Harlan's hands were not going to steady enough for him to go back to the shop and Edna's part-time work at the pharmacy was not going to cover the gap. The market was good, Sylvia said. They could put the money aside and it would be there for them. They moved into Sylvia's house, into the spare bedroom that smelled like fresh paint, and the money from the house went into an account that they were told was theirs to manage, but somehow never quite was. Then Mark's business hit trouble, and could they help just temporarily? Then Boyd had a situation, a legal situation, nothing serious, but he needed funds he didn't have, and he'd pay it back within 60 days. 60 days for certain. Then Colleen's older son needed medical care the insurance wouldn't cover, and how could they say no to that? How could any grandparent say no to that? Then Leland's business venture, the one he was so certain about, the one that just needed a little more capital to get over the hump. Each time a reason. Each time a face they had loved since it was small. Each time Edna's hand on his arm, and her eyes asking him what he wanted to do, and each time Harlan saying yes because the alternative was saying that the people he had raised and fed and driven to school and stayed up worrying about at night were not who he had believed them to be, and he was not ready to believe that. By the time the account showed $212, he was ready. By then, it didn't matter. The last conversation with Sylvia happened in the kitchen of Sylvia's house, a kitchen that was very clean and very modern, and had never once felt like somewhere anyone actually cooked. Sylvia was standing by the counter, and she was speaking in the measured patient voice of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say. She said that things were tight. She said that having them in the house was difficult. She said it with a face full of apology and eyes that held none, and she said that maybe it would be better for everyone if they found their own arrangement. Their own arrangement, as though they were a scheduling conflict rather than her parents. As though the man sitting across from her had not once sat on a hospital chair for 14 hours waiting for news after her appendix ruptured when she was 9 years old. Harlan said nothing. He stood up, went to the garage, sat down on the floor, and put the toolbox on his lap. 2 weeks later, they were in a single room above a bar on Clement Avenue, paying $470 a month for a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and a window that looked out at a brick wall. The bar's ventilation system ran directly under their floor. The smell of beer and fried food seeped up through the boards every night. They slept in their clothes sometimes because the heat only worked when it felt like it. Harlan applied for assistance. He filled out forms. He waited in offices with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, and the particular kind of institutional quiet that is not peace, but is its opposite, a silence full of resigned people who have stopped expecting to be surprised. He was told to wait. He waited. He was told to fill out different forms. He filled them out. He did not tell anyone what he was feeling. He was not entirely sure he had the vocabulary for it. What he felt was this: he had done everything right. He had worked 40 years. He had paid his taxes and his mortgage and his children's orthodontist and his wife's hospital bill. After the surgery in 2009, and the transmission and the pickup and the roof on the house on Dunmore Street, and every other thing that life presented him with a bill for. He had done it without complaint because complaint seemed beside the point when there was work in front of you. He had raised 4 children. He had been faithful to his wife for 52 years. He had not cheated anyone, had not stolen anything, had not asked anyone for a single thing he had not earned. And he was sitting on a cold concrete floor with his right hand trembling and $400 in an account that had once held $137,000. He sat with that. He sat with it the way he sat with a difficult diagnostic problem, not pushing for a conclusion before the evidence was in, not looking away from what was uncomfortable, just sitting with it until it resolved into something he could work with. It was a Tuesday in October when the letter came. Edna found it wedged in the mail slot downstairs between a power company flyer and an advertisement for a pizza restaurant that had closed 2 years ago. She brought it upstairs and set it on the hot plate and looked at it for a moment before she called him over. It was on heavy paper, cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs something, with a printed letterhead in the upper left corner, Fitch and Associates Attorneys at Law, Cedar Hollow, Montana. The address on the envelope was handwritten in a deliberate, careful script, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had learned to write when handwriting still mattered. Harlan read it standing up because he did not sit down for things he did not yet understand. He read it twice. Then he handed it to Edna and watched her face. The letter informed them that a man named Edgar Whitfield, their deceased cousin on Harlan's father's side, had passed away 6 months prior at the age of 89. Edgar Whitfield had left a will that was specific and unambiguous. His entire estate, consisting of a log cabin and 43 acres of forested land in Jefferson County, Montana, was to pass to Harlan and Edna Morse, and to no one else. The property was free of all debts and encumbrances. A small travel fund had been set aside to allow them to inspect the property before making decisions about its future. Edna looked up from the letter. Harlan was already at the phone. Warren Fitch answered on the third ring with the unhurried voice of a man who had practiced law in a small town for 40 years and had come to regard urgency as a form of imprecision. He was warm and he was careful, and he told Harlan exactly what he'd told other inheritors before the cabin was old, built in the early 50s, log construction, hand-hewn. The land was real but remote. The road leading to the property was unpaved for the last 4 miles and impassable in serious snow. There was no utility connection to the grid. The previous owner had installed solar panels some years ago, and there was a hand-dug well out back that still functioned. What's it worth? Harlan asked. There was a pause. I won't mislead you, Warren Fitch said. Land out here has value, but it moves slowly. Remote properties like this, no grid connection, no developed access road, you might see 40,000 on a good day. Maybe 50 if you find the right buyer and you're patient about it. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Tell me about the man who owned it. Another pause, this one different, thoughtful. Edgar was private, Warren said. Lived up there alone for close to 40 years, never married. Kept to himself but caused no trouble. Paid his bills on time, paid his taxes years in advance through a trust he set up in the 70s. Honest man, methodical. He thought carefully about everything he did. Why us? Harlan said. He left a letter with his instructions, Warren Fitch said. He said you were good people, said Harlan Morse had integrity, and his wife had kindness, and that those were rarer than most people understood. The line was quiet for a moment. We barely knew him, Harlan said. I met him twice, maybe 3 times. I know, Warren said. He seemed to know you better than you knew him. That evening, Harlan told his children he called Sylvia first because she was the oldest, and because part of him still operated on the old protocols, the ones that assigned her a respect she had not recently earned. She answered on the 4th ring with the distracted voice of someone doing 2 things at once. He told her about the letter about the cabin, about the land in Montana. He told her they were going to see it. The distraction left her voice immediately. A cabin in Montana. Her tone shifted into something more calculated, more attentive. How much land did you say? 43 acres. A pause. Dad, you can barely manage the stairs here. You cannot handle a property in the middle of nowhere. She said it with what sounded like concern. He recognized it now for what it was, the particular performance of concern that had accompanied every request for money over the past 3 years. Sign the property over to me, she said. I'll handle the sale. We'll split the proceeds fairly. Harlan looked at the toolbox sitting on the floor by the air mattress. No, he said. The words surprised both of them. He had not said it often enough, and for the first time he heard the full weight of it, not anger, not cruelty, just a simple solid refusal like a good weld on structural steel. The words sat between them on the phone line, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and in that moment, Harlan understood something he should have understood years earlier. That no was a complete sentence, that it required no justification, and that the fact it had taken him this long to say it clearly was not a failure of character, but a consequence of loving people who had learned to exploit that love. Boyd called back within the hour. Boyd had apparently already spoken to Sylvia. His voice was the elevated, slightly breathless register he used when he was angry, but trying to sound like he was being reasonable. He said his parents were being selfish. He said they owed the family given everything the family had done for them. He did not specify what the family had done for them, and he seemed to assume the specifics were unnecessary. Colleen texted, 2 words. Call me. Harlan put the phone face down. Leland was last. His message came late after 10 when Harlan was already lying on the mattress, listening to the bar noise below. One line, whatever. Just don't come crying when you're in over your heads. Harlan read it once, turned off the phone, lay in the dark with his eyes open for a while. Then he said, Edna, we leave Thursday. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning in the middle of October, they stood at the Greyhound terminal with everything they owned distributed between 2 duffel bags, a backpack, and the toolbox. The toolbox was heavy. The woman at the ticket counter told him he'd have to check it as cargo. He told her politely that he would carry it on himself, and he did. They rode for 3 days. Ohio passed. Indiana. Illinois went by in the dark, the flat lights of town sliding past the window like the last pages of a chapter. Harlan slept in the seat with his shoulder against Edna's and woke to find they had crossed into Iowa, the land flattening out further, the sky opening up the way it does when you get far enough from the cities, as if the world has remembered it's supposed to be large. They ate gas station sandwiches. They drank bad coffee in styrofoam cups. They watched America unroll outside the window. The way you watch a life you've lived but not quite recognized, familiar in its pieces, strange in its arrangement. Other passengers came and went at stops, young people with headphones who fell asleep immediately, a woman traveling with 2 small children who organized crackers and juice boxes with military precision, an old man in overalls who got on in Nebraska and got off somewhere in South Dakota without speaking to anyone. The bus held all of them equally indifferent to their histories, moving west at the same speed regardless of what any of them were leaving behind or moving toward. Then the land began to change. Wyoming came first, the rolling hills hardening into something older and more deliberate, the horizon pulling back to reveal distances that didn't exist in the Midwest. Then Montana and the first sight of the mountains, not hills, not elevated terrain, but actual mountains, their peaks carrying the first snow of the season, catching the afternoon light and doing something with it that Harlan had no word for. Edna pressed her hand against the cold glass. He watched her watching the mountains and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been clenched for a long time loosening by 1 degree. Not hope exactly. He was 73 years old and had learned enough to be careful about what he called hope, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of possibility, maybe. The acknowledgement that what was ahead was genuinely unknown, and that unknown for the first time in 3 years felt like an opening rather than a threat. Warren Fitch met them at the Cedar Hollow bus depot in a truck that had been working hard for a long time and looked proud of it. He was a man in his early 70s with a handshake that meant something and the kind of economy of movement that comes from decades of doing necessary things without wasted motion. He loaded their bags without being asked. The drive to the property took 40 minutes. The last 12 were on unpaved road, the truck pitching and settling over ruts that the headlights turned into small valleys. Branches reached across the road from both sides. The air that came through the vents smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and the particular cleanness of altitude, the kind of air that made you aware you'd been breathing something lesser for a long time without knowing it. Harlan said very little during the drive. He was watching the road, the tree line, the angle of the terrain. He was doing what he'd always done with new and unfamiliar territory, paying attention without rushing to conclusions, gathering information before forming an opinion. Because an opinion formed without information was just a story you told yourself, and stories you told yourself had a way of blocking out what was actually there. Warren turned off the paved road and followed a track upward for several minutes before the trees opened and the headlights swept across a clearing. The cabin was larger than Harlan had expected. He had pictured something barely standing, something weather-beaten to near collapse, the kind of structure a real estate listing might describe as a fixer-upper, and mean by that something closer to a demolition project. What the headlights showed him was something entirely different. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs darkened with decades of weather to a deep honey color. A steep metal roof, green with age but solidly anchored. A stone chimney rising from the center, substantial and exact. A wide covered porch wrapping the front, its railings carved with patterns that someone had taken time with, not decorative excess, but considered detail, the work of a person who believed that things used every day deserved to be beautiful. Harlan got out of the truck and stood in the clearing. He looked at the cabin the way he looked at a vehicle someone brought in with an unknown history, not for what it appeared to be, but for what it told you about the person who had built and maintained it. He looked at the foundation, which was solid and dry. He looked at the way the logs were notched at the corners, tight and true. He looked at the gutter system, simple but functional, running, clear of debris, and the drainage grade away from the structure, which was correct and intentional. He looked at the porch roof, its pitch exactly right for shedding snow without putting undue stress on the supports. The man who built this, Harlan said, knew what he was doing. Warren Fitch smiled in the dark. He built it himself, over 2 summers, lived in a tent on the property while he worked. Edna had walked to the porch steps and was looking up at the door. She turned around and looked at Harlan across the clearing with an expression he had seen before in other moments, the expression she got when something unexpectedly good was happening and she hadn't yet found the right words for it. Warren handed Harlan the key, old brass worn smooth warm from Warren's pocket. "It's all yours," he said. "No mortgage, no outstanding taxes. Edgar paid everything decades in advance. The solar panels run the lights and a few outlets. The well out back has a hand pump that still pulls clean." He paused. "There's food inside, firewood laid, everything you need for the first few days. I'll leave you to it and come back next week to finalize the paperwork." He climbed back into the truck, and the taillights made 2 red shapes moving away through the trees, and then they were gone. Harlan and Edna stood alone in the clearing. Above them, the stars came out. Not the thin, apologetic stars of a city sky fighting through light pollution and smog. These were stars that didn't have to fight anything dense and close, and indifferent to whether anyone was looking at them going about their ancient business in the dark. Harlan had not seen stars like this since he was a boy, since a camping trip in the Adirondacks, when he was 11 years old and his father had pointed up at the sky and said something he'd forgotten, but whose tone he remembered, a tone of awe that his father, not an expressive man, had allowed himself only in the presence of things too large to pretend at scale. Edna inhaled, held it. "Go on," she said. "Open it." Harlan walked to the door. He put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance, smoothly, as though the mechanism had been kept clean and ready. The door swung open on good hinges, no complaint, no drama. The smell that came out was wood smoke and old paper, and something faintly medicinal, dried herbs maybe, or cedar from a chest somewhere inside. Harlan found the light switch, and the solar-powered lights came on warm and even, and the main room of the cabin opened up in front of them. Bookshelves on every wall filled with volumes whose spines had faded to various degrees depending on their distance from the east-facing windows. A stone fireplace dominating the north end, massive, built from river rock, fitted together with precision that made Harlan step closer without thinking. Because you didn't see masonry like that without wanting to examine it, each stone selected and placed with a care that went beyond function, that spoke of a builder who understood the difference between building something that would last and building something that deserved to. A leather couch worn to softness. A wooden table with 6 chairs, each one hand-built. Each one slightly different in the way that handmade things are different from one another, the variations that are the signature of individual effort rather than production. Wide plank pine floors, dark with decades of use, smooth underfoot. On the mantel, a note in careful handwriting. "Welcome home. Make it yours. Edgar." Edna stood in the middle of the room with her hands clasped and her eyes going over every surface, every shelf, every detail. She looked the way she looked when she walked into a room that needed caring for and felt equal to it. Her whole career had been spent in rooms that needed things, rooms with patients who needed attention and dignity, and the particular quality of presence that Edna had always been able to provide, the quality that made people feel seen rather than processed. She looked at this room now, and Harlan could see her cataloging it, understanding it, already knowing instinctively what it required. Harlan built the fire. He found the wood dry and well split and laid it right on the first try. The kindling caught, and then the larger pieces, and then the room began to warm from the inside out, the stone face of the fireplace soaking up heat and returning it slowly the way good stone does. He stood back from the fire and let the warmth reach him, and for a moment he simply stood there without thinking about anything, which was a thing he had not done in a very long time. Then he looked at the room. It was a habit from 40 years of work, a automatic, almost unconscious habit of reading a space for what it was actually doing, rather than what it appeared to be doing. His eyes went to the walls, tracking lines. They went to the ceiling, noting the span between the beams. They went back to the floor. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He walked to the north end near the fireplace and stopped again. He turned and looked at the eastern wall, then the western wall. Then he turned back to the fireplace, which took up nearly the entire northern face, massive, larger than any heating structure needed to be for a room of this size, larger than the room's proportions seemed to require, even accounting for cold Montana winters. He stepped outside onto the porch. He looked at the exterior north wall. He paced along it, counting his steps deliberately, the way he would have paced the exterior of a building he was assessing for structural work. He went back inside and paced the interior north wall, starting from the corner near the bookshelves and walking toward the fireplace. He stopped. He stood in the center of the main room and stood very still, doing arithmetic that did not resolve the way it should. "Edna," he said. She came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel she'd found somewhere. He said, "This room is smaller than it should be." She looked at him with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things. He said slowly, "The exterior wall on the north side is at least 5 feet further out than where the interior wall stops," he said. He was speaking carefully, the way he spoke when he was working something out, when the diagnosis was forming, but not yet complete. "There's space behind that fireplace that this room doesn't account for. The chimney is real, it draws fine, I can see that, but the fireplace structure is 3 times the size you'd need for a chimney this width. Someone built mass here that serves a purpose other than the fire." Edna looked at the fireplace. She looked at the floor in front of it. She said quietly, "What kind of space?" Harlan looked at the stone face of the chimney. At the river rock fitted together with that extraordinary precision, each stone selected and placed with the care of someone who was not merely building a fireplace, someone who was building something that would hold, something that would wait. He looked at the floor in front of it, wide pine boards burnished to a soft glow, no seam visible, no indication of anything beneath. The boards matched the rest of the floor perfectly in color and grain, which meant whoever had laid them had taken care that they would. You would not do that for a floor you didn't intend to be looked at for a long time. I don't know yet, Harlan said. He stood in the firelight with the warmth of the first good room they'd had in years around them, and he looked at the stone face of the wall that Edgar Whitfield had built with his own hands 70 years ago and maintained alone for nearly 4 decades. Behind him outside the windows, the Montana night pressed against the glass, deep and cold, and full of the sounds of things going about their lives in the dark. 40 years of working with his hands had taught him one thing above all others. Everything that holds something hides it for a reason. And whatever was hidden here had been waiting a very long time to be found by the right person. Harlan Morse looked at his right hand. It was trembling. And it was already reaching for the stone. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Harlan started on the fireplace. Edna had fallen asleep on the leather couch with a quilt pulled over her shoulders and her breathing gone slow and even. And Harlan had sat in the chair across from her for a while, watching the embers pulse and settle like something still thinking through a problem it hadn't yet resolved. He had tried to sleep and found that the cabin's quiet, genuine quiet, the kind he hadn't known in years, had the paradoxical effect of making his mind louder. He was used to sleeping through noise. The bar below their room on Clement Avenue had provided noise enough for a man to disappear into. Here there was nothing to disappear into, only the fire and the dark and the arithmetic problem that the north wall had set him. Then he stood up quietly and went to the fireplace and began to work. He did not use a tool, not yet. He used his hands first the way he always began a new diagnostic, not looking for a solution, just learning the terrain. He ran his palms across the stone face, starting at the bottom left corner and moving right, feeling the surface the way a man reads something in low light, slowly with attention distributed equally across every point of contact. Each river rock was unique. Rounded ones smooth from decades in a creek bed, angular ones with flat faces laid in careful courses, flat ones shingle stacked, where the structure required a horizontal emphasis. The mortar between them was old and tight, no crumbling, no gaps where moisture had gotten in and done its slow work of separation. Whoever had built this had not built it quickly and had not built it without thought. He worked his way up, 3 feet, 4 feet. He was not looking for anything specific. He was listening in the way he had learned to listen to engines, not with his ears, but with his hands, for the difference between what should be there and what actually was. In an engine, that difference was thermal or mechanical, a vibration out of frequency, a resistance either too high or too low. In stone, the difference was simpler. Stone mortared into a wall does not move. It has no give. It transmits force without absorbing it. His hands had learned that fact over decades of incidental contact, and they applied it now without being instructed to. At roughly 4 feet up on the right side of the firebox, his palms stopped moving. He pressed again. The stone moved. Not much, not dramatically. Just a fraction of an inch inward, a give that no stone mortared into a wall should have, a give that said this stone was not what it appeared to be. His hand had found it without being sent to find it, the way his hands had always found what mattered in a complicated system, by paying attention long enough that the thing revealed itself. He pressed harder, a soft click, mechanical, deliberate, the sound of a mechanism engaging after a long period of waiting, precise despite the years. Then silence. Then a sound that was not silence, a deep, low grinding that came not from the fireplace but from somewhere below it, from somewhere beneath the floor stone, moving against stone in the dark, like something waking from a very long sleep. He stepped back. A seam appeared in the floor that had not been there a moment before, running in a perfect rectangle about 4 feet square in front of the fireplace hearth. The boards along that seam had separated by a 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch, the gap widening as the mechanism, whatever mechanism Edgar Whitfield had built into this floor 70 years ago, completed its cycle. The mechanism was smooth. It had been maintained. That told him something about how often Edgar had used it and about the care with which he had kept every part of this place functional. Harlan stood looking at the opening. He looked at it the way he looked at most things that surprised him, without drama, without the noise of reaction, just taking it in and deciding what it meant. Then he went to the workbench, found a pry bar hung on the pegboard exactly where a pry bar should be, and returned to the floor. He worked the bar into the seam carefully, the way you work a tool into anything you don't want to damage, with respect for the craft of the thing you're opening. The panel lifted in one piece, heavier than expected, the underside revealing a framework of iron bracing that explained the weight and also explained the mechanism, a counterbalanced design, the iron doing the work of keeping the panel neutral so that a single trigger point could move it. Edgar had thought this through. He had built it to be operated alone by one person without assistance. He set it aside against the hearth. Beneath it, a set of stone stairs descended into darkness. 12 steps. He counted them as he went down, testing each one before committing to it, the small flashlight from his toolbox held at the angle that made the cracked lens cooperate. The air grew cooler with each step and denser, carrying something he could not immediately name, old paper maybe, and something metallic, and beneath those a dryness that suggested sealed space. The particular stillness of air that has not moved in a very long time, that has been kept rather than simply contained. He reached the bottom and held the flashlight up. The beam found the edge of a wooden crate, then another, then the glint of glass in a frame, then the dark gleam of polished leather. He turned slowly, and as his eyes adjusted to what the small light was giving him, the space began to resolve itself out of the darkness the way a photograph develops slowly, incrementally, fact by fact, presenting itself until the whole picture is undeniable. The chamber was large, not a crawl space, not a root cellar, a room the same footprint as the cabin's main floor above, with a vaulted ceiling of hand-hewn timber beams that showed the same quality of work as everything else Edgar had built. Adequate was not sufficient. Correct was the minimum, and excellent was what was worth doing. The walls were smooth, fitted stone, the same river rock as the fireplace, fitted with the same precision. Wooden crates lined 3 walls, stacked carefully, each one labeled in black marker, with a combination of letters and numbers in neat handwriting. Shelving units held leather-bound books with gold-embossed spines. Wooden boxes of varying sizes sat on a low platform along the eastern wall. In the far corner, something large and rectangular stood covered with a canvas tarp, and at the center of the room sat a desk. Heavy oak, the kind built to last rather than to impress. The surface organized with the kind of deliberateness that spoke not of neatness for its own sake, but of a mind that worked best when its tools were precisely where it expected them to be. Papers in 3 stacked columns, each column uniform in height. A green-shaded brass lamp, its cord running to a wall outlet that fed from the solar system above. A leather journal open at its last entry, a pen laid diagonally across the page, as though set down mid-thought. Everything coated in a fine, even layer of dust, undisturbed, patient, exactly as it had been left. Harlan stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment without moving. Then he walked to the nearest crate and pried it open with his hands, the wood dry enough that it gave without much resistance. Inside, wrapped in newspaper from 1968, a newspaper with a headline about a presidential election, and an advertisement for a Chevrolet that cost less than a month's current rent on Clement Avenue, was a painting. He lifted it out carefully, peeling back the paper the way you peel back anything that has been protecting something for a long time without thanks. Even in the flashlight's narrow beam, the colors held. Rich and deep, the kind of pigment that good paint keeps across decades when the conditions are correct, as these conditions clearly had been. It was a landscape, mountains and cloud formations, rendered in long, dramatic strokes, the kind of painting that made you feel the weight of the sky it depicted. Not merely representational, but interpretive, the hand of a painter who understood that paint was not a recording medium, but an expressive one. He turned it over. In the lower right corner of the canvas, a signature, A. Bierstadt. He set it against the crate and opened the journal on the desk. The handwriting inside was the same as the exterior labels, controlled, exact, formed with care. The journal was titled on its first page, in the same careful script, Private Collection and Estate Records. Property of Edgar R. Whitfield. Begun January 1963. He read the first entry, standing up, his flashlight casting a pool of light over the pages. April 15th, 1963. Landscape by Albert Bierstadt. Oil on canvas, 36 by 24 inches. Purchased at estate sale, Portland, Oregon. Price paid $375. Current estimated value at time of purchase, unknown. Note, the market does not yet understand what it has. He turned several pages. June 1964. First edition collected works, Shakespeare, folio. Purchased from a private dealer in San Francisco. Price paid $800. Condition exceptional. This will matter to someone someday. He turned more pages. Faster now. Entry after entry, year after year. Paintings and sculptures. Rare books and hand-drawn maps. Coins in individual velvet cases. Roman, Byzantine, medieval, European, each one labeled in Edgar's handwriting with its origin, its date, its condition. Stock certificates for companies whose names Harlan recognized from decades of newspaper headlines, IBM, Apple, Microsoft. Bonds from corporations and municipalities. Each entry documented with the same methodical care date of acquisition, price paid, source, condition, authentication notes. And beside each entry, at intervals of roughly 5 years, an updated estimated value in different ink, the same handwriting, but the ink changing color as the decades changed, blue to black to blue again. Edgar Whitfield returning to his records over and over across 30 years to update what he understood about what he had. The discipline of it was extraordinary. Not the discipline of a man obsessed, but the discipline of a man committed. There was a difference, and it was visible in the handwriting, which remained consistent and calm across 3 decades rather than becoming more compressed or urgent as the values grew. Harlan turned to the last pages. The final accounting entry was dated September of 1994. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, the way they moved when he was reading something that required more than his eyes. Final accounting as of this date. Total estimated value of collection based on current market conditions and independent professional appraisals completed August of this year, as follows. Paintings and sculptures, $73,200,000. Rare books and manuscripts, $18,500,000. Coins and precious metals, $42,800,000. Stocks and bonds, $112,300,000. Miscellaneous items, $18,200,000. Total estimated value, $265 million. He read the number again. He read it a third time. Then he sat down on the stone floor because his legs had made a decision without consulting him, and he sat there in the cool stillness of the vault with his flashlight in his hand and the open journal across his knees, and $265 million worth of carefully documented human achievement stacked in the darkness around him, and he breathed. He breathed for a long time. Below the final accounting, he noticed a smaller entry in slightly different ink added at a later date, perhaps years later. The handwriting was the same, but the pen had been different, finer, and the ink was darker, the black of a newer cartridge against the aged brown-black of the 1994 entries. It read, "The collection is complete. What remains is to wait. I have made the arrangements. The right person will come. E.W." He read that twice also. Then he got up, went back up the stairs, crossed the main room to the couch, and put his hand on Edna's shoulder. She was awake immediately, the way she'd always been. 40 years of night shifts had turned her into a person who moved from sleep to full attention without a transition period. She sat up. She looked at his face. "Come downstairs," he said. "There's something you need to see." He watched her face go through the same sequence. His had disbelief, then the slow weight of belief arriving to replace it, then something harder to name, something that existed in the space between understanding a fact and knowing what to do with it. She stood at the desk and read the final accounting entry twice, then read the small added note below it, and then looked at the stacked crates and the shelved books and the covered shape in the prints, and then she looked at him. "Harlan." "I know. I know." They stood together in the vault for a long time, not saying much because there was not much to say that the room hadn't already said for itself. Eventually, Edna went to the shelving unit and pulled down a different journal. This one older, its leather cover cracked with age, its spine worn to near nothing. She opened it and began reading aloud. The entry was from 1958, before the cabin had been built, before Edgar had moved to Montana at all. He had been 33 years old, worked as accountant at Harrison & Sons for 12 years, saved 60% of every paycheck. lived below my means while everyone around me treated income as a floor to build from rather than a ceiling to work under. Studied markets when I wasn't working. Studied art. Studied history. Learned to see value before others did, which is less a talent than a discipline. The discipline of not needing to be told what something is worth before deciding for yourself. She turned pages. Another entry, this one dated 1960, moving to Montana this year. I have found land nobody wants because it is inconvenient. Inconvenient is fine. Inconvenient keeps company away. I am not running from anything. I am going towards something. The difference matters. She turned more pages. An entry from 1973. Attended a family gathering in Ohio. Cousin Harlan Morse was there with his wife. Their children were young. I watched Harlan support two of his brothers through most of the afternoon when they were too grief-stricken to manage themselves. Nobody supported Harlan. He didn't seem to require it. I don't know if I've ever seen a cleaner portrait of a man's character than the one I saw today. He held people up and asked for nothing in return because holding people up was simply the correct thing to do in that situation. I watched him for 2 hours and he never once looked at the room to see if anyone was noticing. Edna stopped reading. Harlan took the journal from her hands and found the next marked entry. 1987, family reunion in Oregon. Observed Harlan and his wife Edna with their 4 children. The children are becoming what entitled children become, people who experience love as supply in themselves as demand. I see how it ends. I've seen this pattern in businesses and families and individuals. There is a predictable sequence from spoiled to exploitative to abandoned, and the people left holding nothing at the end of that sequence are the ones who gave the most. Harlan will be left holding nothing. Someone should do something about that. I am beginning to think that someone is me. The vault was very quiet, not the strained quiet of the apartment above the bar on Clement Avenue, where silence was just the absence of noise and could be broken at any moment by the sounds of a world that didn't know or care about the 2 people inside it. This was the quiet of a space that had been built to hold things built, carefully built to last, built by a man who had understood that some things needed protection from the world and had provided it across decades of solitary patient effort. He saw it, Edna said. 20 years before it happened, he saw exactly what was coming. Harlan set the journal down. He looked at the room around them, the crates, the shelves, the covered shape in the corner. He looked at the desk, at the pen still lying diagonally across the last journal page, at the brass lamp waiting to be switched on. He built a room for us, he said. That's what this is. He spent 37 years building a room for us, and he waited. They spent 3 more hours in the vault that first night, moving through it systematically. Harlan opening crates, Edna cross-referencing the journal entries, both of them building a picture of the whole. The Bierstadt. A Mary Cassatt portrait, small and precise and alive with light. An Andrew Wyeth acquired in 1971 before anyone outside the art world understood what Wyeth's work would become. A bronze sculpture of a horse whose surface had acquired the deep green patina of genuine age. Roman coins in velvet cases. Byzantine artifacts documented with the care of a museum curator. Stock certificates for Apple Computer, dated 1976, when the company had been 2 years old. First editions by authors whose work had become canonical, Twain Hemingway, Fitzgerald Faulkner. A framed map from 1702 showing the unexplored interior of the American continent. Each piece was not merely valuable. Each piece had been chosen by someone who understood what it was before the market agreed. By the time they climbed back up the stairs and sealed the entrance behind them and sat down at the kitchen table, as dawn began to show in the eastern windows, they understood the shape of what they had inherited. The numbers were real. The documentation was real. The authenticity of each piece was supported by paperwork filed in labeled folders in the back of the shelving unit, organized by year and category, in the handwriting of a man who had spent his professional life making numbers honest. Harlan made 2 decisions before the coffee had finished brewing. The first was that no one would know about the vault until he understood what protecting it required. Not Warren Fitch, not Edna's sister in Cleveland, not anyone. He had not survived 3 years of systematic financial exploitation by being careless about information, and he was not going to start now. The second was that he would not wait for someone else to tell him what to do. He would drive into Cedar Hollow, find whoever knew this county, and gather the information he needed to make his own decisions. He had spent 40 years doing that, arriving at a problem without assumptions, gathering facts first, forming a plan second. The problem had changed in scale. The principle had not. His hands were trembling. That didn't mean he couldn't work. The next morning, he drove the used truck that Warren Fitch had helped him acquire, a practical necessity for anyone living this far from pavement, into Cedar Hollow. The town was small enough that its main street could be taken in at a single glance. A general store, a hardware store, a diner with hand-lettered specials on a chalkboard in the window, a post office, a gas station, and a brick building set slightly back from the others with a hand-lettered sign, Cedar Hollow Public Library. Open Tuesday through Saturday. It was a Wednesday. The woman behind the desk was in her mid-60s, silver hair in a practical braid, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their lives in rooms full of other people's knowledge and have absorbed some of it simply by proximity. She looked up when he came in and said, before he'd introduced himself, "You're the one who took over Edgar Whitfield's place." It was not a question. "Word travels," Harlan said. "In a town of 312 people," she said, "word doesn't travel so much as simply arrive." She set down the book she'd been cataloging. "Sit down, you want coffee?" Her name was Harriet Blaine, and she had been the librarian in Cedar Hollow for 31 years. She had known Edgar Whitfield in the way that people in small towns know the solitary people among them, not intimately but attentively, the way you watch something that doesn't ask to be watched, but rewards watching. She had seen him come in for books every month, always with a specific request, always returning what he borrowed in the condition it had left in. She had heard him make comments about markets and art and history that she hadn't fully understood at the time, but had written down because they seemed to mean something. Over 30 years, the accumulation of those comments had formed a picture. She went to a filing cabinet and came back with a folder. Inside it, newspaper clippings spanning 3 decades of financial press, art market coverage, a few pieces from general interest magazines. Each clipping was annotated in pencil in the margins. Small, neat notes in Harriet's handwriting. Edgar bought similar 1963. Edgar invested here 1976. Edgar acquired 3 before anyone knew the name. You tracked his investments, Harlan said. He'd mentioned things sometimes, Harriet said. Small comments, passing observations. A painting he found interesting. A company he thought had potential. He never talked about money directly. But I listened and I could read a financial page. She looked at Harlan without apology. Over 30 years, the picture became clear. Edgar Whitfield was the most sophisticated private investor I've ever encountered, and I've been reading about finance since before most people thought it was worth reading about. She pulled a photograph from the bottom of the folder. Edgar Whitfield, younger, perhaps 40, standing in front of the cabin on a summer day. Not smiling, but his eyes carrying something that Harlan recognized after a moment of looking. It was the expression of a man who had worked out the fundamental problem of his life and found a solution he believed in. The expression of a person who has stopped performing and started inhabiting. He asked me to hold that, Harriet said, years ago. Said whoever inherited the place would want to know he'd been content there. Harlan held the photograph. He was more than content, Harriet said. He was purposeful. That's rarer. He drove back up the mountain with the photograph on the seat beside him, and Harriet's words settling into the part of his mind where he kept things that needed further consideration. He spent the afternoon making the copies he'd decided to make, photographing every page of every journal in the vault, with the digital camera he'd found among Edgar's things backing up the images to 3 separate memory cards, storing one in the toolbox, one in the inside pocket of his coat, and one in a fireproof tin he found in the workroom and buried in a marked location at the edge of the tree line. Then he called Warren Fitch, not to ask for help, to hire it. There was a difference, and he wanted Warren to understand the difference from the first sentence. He told Warren what he'd found. He told it straightforwardly, accurately, completely, without embellishment or performance. He heard the silence on the other end of the line that was not ordinary silence. He gave Warren the time he needed. Edgar, Warren Fitch said finally quietly, that remarkable, infuriating private man. Can it be protected legally? Harlan asked. Yes, Warren said, but properly and quickly. I'm going to bring in a colleague from Billings, someone who specializes in trust at this level. You'll want everything in a structure that can't be challenged from any direction. How long? A week, maybe 10 days. Do it, Harlan said. He spent the next 12 days learning the property while Warren worked. He walked the full perimeter of all 43 acres using the topographical map from Edgar's study, making his own notes on a legal pad. He located the well and tested the pump stripped and cleaned the mechanism, replaced a worn gasket from materials he found in the workroom. He serviced the solar system, clearing a season's worth of pine needles from the panels, checking the battery connections, tightening what the temperature cycles had loosened. He found a lean-to structure behind the cabin that Edgar had used for wood storage and spent 3 afternoons splitting logs to build the stack back up before winter came properly. His hands shook throughout. He worked anyway because the alternative to working with shaking hands was not working, and not working had never once solved a problem. There was something in the physical work that the months in the apartment above the bar had taken from him, not the ability to do it, but the right to feel it mattered. On the mountain, that right came back, not loudly, through the side door of small actions done correctly over consecutive days. Edna established her own routines. She organized Edgar's kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had managed supply closets in hospitals for decades. She cooked on the wood stove initially with the careful attention of someone learning a new instrument, then with the comfortable competence that came from understanding its rhythms. She read through Edgar's personal journals, not the collection records, but the smaller notebooks he'd kept separately filled with observations and reflections, a 30-year record of a private mind working through the world. She told Harlan in the evenings what she found in them, and Harlan listened the way he always listened to Edna fully, because she had never in 52 years pointed him towards something that wasn't worth looking at. On the 10th day, Warren arrived with his colleague. She drove up from Billings, a woman named Vera Stanton, in her early 50s, with a face that suggested she had heard most human stories at least twice and maintained her equilibrium through all of them. She spent 2 days in the vault working with methodical thoroughness. She photographed, she cataloged, she cross-referenced the journal entries against the authentication certificates Edgar had filed in labeled folders. She emerged on the 3rd day and sat with Harlan and Edna at the kitchen table and told them what they had. "The documentation is extraordinary," she said. "Every piece has a clear chain of custody. Every acquisition is supported by authenticated paperwork. The trust structure Edgar set up in the 1970s is solid and has been properly maintained, taxes paid, filings current, everything correct. He left no vulnerabilities. None." She looked at them steadily. "But I need you to understand what happens next," she said. "Once word gets out, and it will get out, it always does, you will face pressure from multiple directions. The IRS will want to assess, auction houses will come calling, and your family." She didn't finish the sentence. "Our family already knows there's a cabin," Harlan said. "They don't know what's under it." "Not yet," Vera said. He understood what she meant. He had understood it since the day Sylvia's voice had shifted from distracted to attentive the moment he said 43 acres. The situation had the shape of a situation in which evidence would matter, and the shape of a situation in which certain precautions were not paranoia but preparation. He spent the following 2 weeks doing the things he'd decided to do while Warren and Vera completed the legal structure. He bought 6 motion-activated trail cameras at the hardware store in Cedar Hollow, the kind ranchers use to monitor fence lines weatherproof with night vision with a range of 30 feet. He mounted them at angles that covered every approach to the cabin and both ground-level windows, placing each one carefully to eliminate blind spots. He did not announce this. He did not discuss it with Warren or Vera. He simply did it because it was the prudent thing, and prudence was something he'd spent 40 years practicing. He was not surprised, therefore, when it happened. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after they'd arrived, when he heard the vehicles coming up the road. He was on the porch splitting wood. He heard the engines while they were still in the trees, more than one moving, at the kind of speed that people move when they have already decided something and are in the process of executing it. He set down the axe and stood up and looked toward the tree line. 3 vehicles came into the clearing. A late-model sedan, recently washed with Ohio plates. An SUV with out-of-state plates from Minnesota. A pickup truck that had seen hard use. The sedan doors opened first, and Sylvia stepped out dressed in the kind of careful, expensive clothing she always wore when she was about to negotiate something. Mark Hadley got out of the sedan's front passenger seat, looking at the property with an appraiser's eyes, which told Harlan everything he needed to know about who had financed this trip and for what purpose. Boyd came out of the back of the sedan, already red in the face. Colleen got out of the SUV looking at the ground. Leland came out of the pickup truck with his hands in his pockets and did not immediately move toward the others. From the sedan's rear passenger seat, a man got out carrying a briefcase. He wore a suit that belonged in a bigger city and the particular expression of a lawyer who was being paid well enough to be confident about whatever he was about to say. Clifton Dunbar Harlan would learn. From St. Paul. Sylvia had found him quickly. Behind Dunbar, a woman got out of the SUV with a camera. Not a phone camera. A camera with a professional lens. Harlan looked at the camera for a moment. Then he looked at his children, all four of them, and Mark Hadley assembled in the clearing of a cabin that an old man had built by hand 70 years ago, for reasons none of them would ever fully understand. He walked down the porch steps and stood at the bottom. He waited. Sylvia came forward first the way she always did, taking the front of the room by instinct. Her expression was calibrated, not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the engineered middle that people aim for when they want to look reasonable while doing unreasonable things. She was performing concern, and she was good at it. She'd had practice. "Dad," she said, "we were worried." "No, you weren't," Harlan said. The calibration slipped slightly. "We have concerns," she said, "about your ability to manage a complicated estate, about the influence of people who may not have your best interest." "Sylvia," Harlan said. His voice was flat and final, the voice of a completed diagnosis. "You're here because you found out about the money. That's the beginning and the end of why you're here. Don't dress it up." Boyd stepped forward. Boyd had never been able to tolerate the moment when performance was set aside in favor of directness. It made him feel correctly that he was out of his depth. "You don't have the right to make these decisions alone," he said. "You're 73 years old. You had a stroke. You're living in the middle of nowhere." "I have family support," Harlan said. "I'm standing next to her." Edna stood at his right shoulder. She had come out of the cabin while he was watching his children come across the clearing and had positioned herself without fanfare and without request exactly where she had positioned herself for 52 years at his side in alignment. Boyd started again. "We don't have anything more to discuss," Harlan said. "The property belongs to us. It was left to us, specifically to us, by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. You have no claim to it. None." Clifton Dunbar stepped forward with the ease of a man who viewed the law primarily as leverage. He introduced himself. He cited the petition for emergency guardianship. He intended to file Harlan's age, his medical history, his isolation, his apparent estrangement from his family. He used the word welfare 3 times in 4 sentences. Harlan listened to all of it. Then he said, "You'll be hearing from my attorney." Dunbar smiled the smile of a man who has heard that before from people who couldn't back it up. "Of course," he said. "We'll look forward to that." The photograph was being taken continuously, the weathered cabin, the 2 elderly people in worn coats, the wild tree line behind them. A photograph that could be made to mean several things depending on the words placed beneath it. Harlan looked directly into the camera. He did not look confused. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years diagnosing problems and had just finished diagnosing this one. The vehicles turned around in the clearing and went back down the road. Their engines faded, then were gone. The clearing was quiet again, but a different quiet now, the quiet after something has declared itself. Edna spoke first. "What do we do?" Boo! Harlan picked up the axe he'd set down when he heard the engines. He looked at the log on the splitting block. He raised the axe and brought it down, and the wood separated cleanly along the grain. "We get ready," he said. He split 3 more logs before he stopped and went inside to call Warren Fitch. 2 weeks later, the cameras triggered at 2 in the morning. 2 men he didn't recognize forced the workroom window on the cabin's east side, got through it, and spent 40 minutes inside before leaving with a file folder that contained nothing of consequence. Harlan had made sure after the first visit from his children that anything consequential was either in the vault in his coat pocket or buried at the tree line. The camera had recorded their faces clearly. Sheriff Clem Bassett had a copy of the footage within the hour. Boyd's whereabouts on the night in question were, according to Warren's preliminary inquiries, unaccounted for. That night, Harlan lay in bed and listened to the wind in the pines and understood that the situation had moved from a legal dispute to something that included criminal action, and that this changed things in a direction that ultimately favored him, not his children. Evidence of a break-in was evidence of desperation. Desperate people made mistakes. Mistakes left records. He was not afraid. He had the vault below him full of documented truth. He had a legal structure being built around it by capable people. He had 40 years of habit that had never once told him to panic when something broke. He had Edna, and he had the knowledge that Edgar Whitfield had seen him clearly across a distance of decades and had decided that what he saw was worth protecting. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the largest thing anyone had done for Harlan Morris in his 73 years, the simple, extraordinary act of being seen accurately by someone with the wisdom to understand what they were looking at and the patience to act on it correctly. His right hand rested on the quilt. It was trembling. Somewhere below the floor in the cool dark of the vault that Edgar had built and sealed and waited 30 years to give away $265 million worth of careful, patient, purposeful work was waiting to be used by the right person in the right way. Edgar had been certain of who that was for 20 years. Harlan was beginning to believe it himself. The first thing Harlan did the morning after his children came to the mountain was sit down at Edgar's desk with a legal pad and a ballpoint pen and begin to write. Not a letter, not a statement, a timeline. He had done this for customers at the shop when a repair was complicated and the customer needed to understand what had happened to their vehicle and in what sequence. He had learned early that people who are confused or afraid respond better to sequence than to argument. Give them the order of events. Lay it out clearly. Let the facts speak in the voice of chronology, which is the most persuasive voice there is because it cannot be accused of having a perspective. He started in the year they sold the house on Dunmore Street. He wrote the date, the sale price, the account the money had gone into, then the first withdrawal, the amount, the stated reason, the name of the person who had asked, then the second, then the third, a sonnet. He wrote without editorializing, without adjectives, without the kind of language that sounds angry even when it is only accurate. He wrote the way he had always compiled a diagnostic report. This happened, then this, and here is where the system failed. He worked for 2 hours. When he was done, he had 4 pages of single-spaced entries that constituted a complete financial record of the 3 years in which his children had systematically taken everything he and Edna had accumulated in a lifetime of work. Every date, every dollar, every stated reason that had turned out not to be the real reason. He read it through once, made 2 corrections for accuracy, and called Warren Fitch. "I have something for you," he said. Warren arrived that afternoon with Vera Stanton and a third person, a man named Robert Mercer, who drove up from Helena and had the settled, unhurried manner of someone who had spent many years in courtrooms and had come to regard urgency as a form of error. He specialized in defending against fraudulent guardianship claims. He had handled 31 such cases in 12 years. He had lost 2. Mercer read Harlan's timeline at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold in his cup. He read it the way Harlan had written it, without visible reaction, processing, rather than responding, building a picture before opening his mouth. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Harlan. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "This morning," Harlan said. "In what order did you compile the records?" "Chronological. The bank statements are in the folder underneath. I pulled copies through the online account before we left Ohio." Mercer picked up the folder and went through it methodically, matching entries to Harlan's timeline. He spent 15 minutes on this without saying anything. Then he looked up. "Mr. Morse, in 30 years of law, I've had clients hand me the case I needed in 3 or 4 documents. I've never had one hand me the case in a 4-page memo they wrote the morning after being threatened. I used to explain complicated repairs to customers," Harlan said. "If you understand the sequence, you understand the problem." Mercer looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded a single complete nod. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." They spent the rest of the afternoon building the legal structure around what Harlan had already built in logic. Vera confirmed that the trust was fully established, fully documented, and fully resistant to any competency-based challenge. 2 independent psychologists from Billings were scheduled for the following week, a formality. Mercer said that would produce documentation effectively ending the competency argument before it could be made in court. "The camera footage," Harlan said, "from the break-in." Mercer looked at him. "What break-in?" Harlan told him. He described the cameras, their placement, the footage. He described what had been taken, a folder containing nothing and why nothing consequential had been available to take. He described handing the footage to Sheriff Bassett the morning after. Mercer was quiet for a moment. "You set the cameras before the break-in," he said. "I set them the day after my children came here with a lawyer and a photographer," Harlan said. "I didn't know there would be a break-in. I knew the situation had the shape of a situation in which evidence would eventually matter, and I preferred to have it." Mercer looked at Warren Fitch. Warren looked at the window. "I'll need copies of everything," Mercer said. 3 days before the hearing, Leland called. Not Harlan. Edna. He called her cell phone at 7 in the evening while Harlan was on the porch watching the last of the light leave the mountains, the sky going from orange to purple to a deep cold blue that seemed to press down toward the tree line. She came to the doorway after 20 minutes. "Leland withdrew his name from the petition," she said. "He did it last week before they came up here. He didn't tell us because he didn't expect us to believe him without proof." Harlan looked at the mountains. "He also recorded the family meeting where they planned the guardianship strategy," Edna said. "He says he has Boyd on tape talking about how to characterize your stroke. He says he has Sylvia directing the photographer on what narrative to build around the pictures." Harlan was quiet. "He wants to give it to Mercer," Edna said. "Why is he doing this now?" Edna came out onto the porch and stood beside him. "He said he couldn't defend what they were planning," she said. "He said he drove up here after they all got back parked at the bottom of the mountain road and tried to figure out whether to come up. He sat there for an hour before he turned around. He said he saw the foundation being built and understood the difference between what we were doing with what we'd been given and what his siblings were trying to do to get it." Harlan said nothing for a long time. "He doesn't expect forgiveness," Edna said. "He was clear about that. He said he's not calling for forgiveness. He's calling because it's the right thing and he's done waiting to do the right thing." The evening wind moved through the pines. Far out over the peaks, a line of cloud was coming in the high, thin kind that meant overnight temperatures would drop. "Tell him to send the recording to Mercer," Harlan said. He went inside and built up the fire and sat in the chair across from the fireplace and looked at the stone face of the wall that Edgar had built. He sat there for a long time and thought about what it meant to act correctly when acting correctly cost you something. He had done that his whole life, and for 3 years, it had seemed to mean nothing, to be a characteristic the world had no practical use for. Edgar had disagreed with that assessment. Edgar had staked 37 years and $265 million on his disagreement. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a stone building that had been standing since 1924. Its columns were the kind that small American county seats built when they wanted to say something permanent about justice, that it had weight that it held, that it did not bend with the season. Harlan had driven past it twice since arriving in Cedar Hollow. Without going in the way, you drive past a place you know you'll eventually have to enter and feel no need to hurry toward. He went in on a Tuesday morning in November. He wore his good flannel shirt and the canvas work jacket with the worn elbows. He had considered something more formal and decided against it because he was not trying to perform the role of a man with resources. He was trying to be what he was, a working man with a legitimate claim who was prepared to document every element of that claim clearly and completely. The clothes were true, and true was sufficient. Edna wore her blue wool coat, the one she'd had since 1992, the one she'd worn on the bus to Montana. It still fit. It still held. Mercer and Fitch flanked them in the hallway outside the courtroom. Behind them, filling the benches with the quiet solidarity of people who have made a decision to show up, were the residents of Cedar Hollow. Harriet Blaine from the library. Sheriff Clem Bassett in full uniform. His presence, the particular statement that a law enforcement officer makes by appearing somewhere in an official capacity without being required to. The man who ran the hardware store who had sold Harlan the trail cameras without asking questions. The woman from the diner who had given them free coffee on 3 separate occasions after learning who they were and what had brought them to the mountain. 14 people in total. None of them had been asked to come. Harlan looked at them once and then looked away because the thing he felt when he looked at them was too large for a courthouse hallway. Across the hall, Sylvia stood near the window in a dark suit, her face set in the expression she'd learned for situations she needed to control. Mark Hadley stood beside her, looking at his phone. Boyd sat on a bench with his elbows on his knees, his face the color of bad weather. Colleen sat beside him, looking at the floor. Clifton Dunbar conferred with 2 associates near the courtroom door. The three of them moving papers between briefcases with the purposeful inefficiency of people being paid by the hour. Leland was not there. He had sent the recording and withdrawn, which was the appropriate thing, and Harlan understood it as such, not absence but restraint, a recognition that his role in this chapter had already been played. The courtroom was smaller than Harlan had imagined. The judge's bench was high, and the morning light came in at an angle that fell across the room with the particular flatness of November sun illuminating everything without warming it. Judge Miriam Halstead entered through the side door precisely at 9 o'clock, her robe straight, her bearing that of a woman who had presided over enough human damage to have lost all patience with performances of innocence and all tolerance for the waste of the court's time. She settled at the bench. She looked out over the room. "Be seated," she said. Clifton Dunbar presented his case for 40 minutes. He was skilled at it in the way that expensive lawyers are skilled. He selected facts, carefully arranged them persuasively, and surrounded them with enough legitimate legal language that the omissions were not immediately visible. He cited Harlan's stroke, his age, his isolation, the speed with which he had reportedly made significant financial decisions following an unexpected inheritance. He cited the lack of family contact as evidence of outside manipulation. He presented the photographs taken by the photographer who had accompanied his clients to the cabin. In the photographs looked weathered and remote and slightly ominous, which is what you get when you point a professional camera at a 70-year-old log structure in November and remove everything around it that provides context. He did not cite the $137,000. He did not cite the apartment above the bar on Clement Avenue. He did not cite Sylvia's words in the kitchen, "You need to find your own arrangement." Mercer rose when Dunbar sat down. He spoke for 25 minutes. He did not perform urgency or outrage. He laid the sequence of events in front of Judge Halstead the way Harlan had laid it in front of him, chronologically, specifically supported at every point by documentation that was either in the folder the bailiff had passed to the bench or available to be produced on request. He established the $137,000, not as accusation, as fact. He entered the bank statements. He entered the timeline Harlan had written on the legal pad. He entered the statements from the two psychologists whose conclusions were consistent. Both Harlan and Edna Morris were cognitively sharp, emotionally resilient, and fully competent to manage their own affairs. One of the psychologists had added a sentence to her report that was not required by the evaluation protocol. These are not people whose judgment has been compromised. These are people whose judgment has been tested repeatedly and held. Mercer entered the camera footage without extensive commentary. He noted that it existed, that it had been authenticated by Sheriff Bassett, that it showed two individuals entering the Morse property without authorization, and that the investigation was ongoing. Boyd's jaw tightened. Clifton Dunbar wrote something on his legal pad without looking up. Then Mercer entered the audio recording from Leland. He played 3 minutes of it through the small speaker on the evidence table, Boyd's voice discussing how to frame Harlan's stroke for maximum legal impact, Sylvia directing the photographer on which angles would best support a narrative of neglect and isolation. The recording was clear. The voices were identifiable. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something irrevocable has just been said in them. Judge Halstead had been reading through the folder during Mercer's presentation with the focused attention of someone for whom documents are frequently more reliable than testimony. She looked up when Mercer sat down. "I have one additional matter to address," she said. She reached beneath the bench and produced an envelope. It was cream-colored. Harlan recognized the paper stock. "This envelope was filed with this court in 1994, Judge Halstead said. It was filed by Edgar R. Whitfield through his attorney Warren Fitch with specific written instructions that it be opened only in the event of legal challenges to his estate by family members of the named beneficiaries." She held it up. "Those conditions have been met." Clifton Dunbar looked at the envelope. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has not accounted for and cannot immediately categorize. Judge Halstead broke the seal herself. She read the contents in silence, first, her expression moving through a sequence that Harlan could not fully read from where he sat, but that contained at one point something that looked like recognition, the look of a person who has seen a particular pattern before and is seeing it again in a new form, and is not surprised to find it here in this room in this century. Then she read it aloud. "To whatever court may be reviewing this matter. My name is Edgar Raymond Whitfield. I write this in sound mind on September 14th, 1994, before a notary and I file it with the court as a permanent record of my intentions and my reasoning. I have spent the better part of 20 years observing Harlan and Edna Morse from a careful distance. I have observed them at family gatherings, at moments of grief, at moments of difficulty that they did not know anyone was watching. I have seen Harlan support others who were not supporting him. I have seen Edna give care she was not given in return. I have watched across 2 decades as people who deserved better received worse, and I have made my decision accordingly. I leave my entire estate to Harlan and Edna Morse because they are people of integrity in a world that taxes integrity and rewards its absence. I leave it to them unconditionally. I leave it to them because I have no doubt whatsoever that they will know what to do with it. I also leave this letter because I know the people who will contest this bequest. I have watched them too. I know what they are and I know what they will do, and I know that they will dress their motives in the language of concern because they have learned that concern is harder to argue against than greed. Let the record show that I anticipated this precisely. Let the record show that any member of Harlan Morse's family who contests this will files for guardianship or takes legal action to claim any portion of my estate shall be permanently barred from any benefit derived from that estate and shall bear the full cost of any legal proceedings they have initiated. This is not a punitive measure. It is a recognition that some choices carry consequences and that integrity and its opposite are both self-fulfilling. Build something that matters, Harlan. That's all I ask. Edgar Raymond Whitfield, notarized Jefferson County, Montana, September 14th, 1994. The courtroom was silent in the complete way that courtrooms go silent when the weight of what has just been said is still settling over the people inside them. Sylvia's face had gone the particular white of someone who has experienced a sudden and total reversal of a situation they believed they controlled. Boyd sat motionless. Colleen had her hand pressed over her mouth. Mark Hadley, who had initiated this entire chain of events with a comment at a dinner table years ago about equity not working hard enough, stared at the floor. Clifton Dunbar did not move for a long moment. Then he reached over and wrote something on his legal pad, turned it so his associates could read it, and watched them nod. Judge Halstead set the letter down. She looked at Sylvia, at Boyd, at Colleen. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, without hurry, without theater, with the clear eyes of someone who has no investment in what they find, but every investment in seeing it accurately. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied, she said. The medical evidence establishes competency. The financial records establish a pattern of exploitation by the petitioners, not of the respondents. The testator's letter filed with this court 30 years ago demonstrates a clarity of intention and a precision of foresight that is frankly extraordinary. She paused. The petitioners will bear all legal costs incurred by the respondents in defending this action. She looked at Clifton Dunbar. Counselor, the break-in investigation is active. I would advise your clients to cooperate fully with Sheriff Bassett's office. I would further advise you to have a conversation with your clients about the audio recording that was entered into evidence this morning and what it implies about the nature of their original claims. She picked up her gavel. This matter is closed. The crack of the gavel was not loud. In a larger courtroom, it might have been swallowed by the acoustics. In this room, it was exactly loud enough, and it was exactly final. Harlan did not feel triumph. He had expected to feel something that resembled triumph, and what he felt instead was quieter and more complicated, the feeling he got when a long and difficult job was finally correctly completed. Not celebration. Just the clean recognition of a thing done right, finished, closed. The recognition that the correct outcome had occurred, which was satisfying without being joyful, because the correct outcome had required all of this, and all of this had included things that should never have been required. He shook Robert Mercer's hand. He shook Warren Fitch's hand. He walked out of the courthouse with Edna through the door and into the November air, which was sharp and cold and carried the smell of coming snow. Behind them, Cedar Hollow's 14 people came out in ones and twos. Harriet Blaine touched Edna's arm. Sheriff Bassett nodded at Harlan with the brief, direct acknowledgement of one person to another when a serious thing has been handled seriously. Harlan looked back once at the courthouse door. Sylvia and Boyd came out several minutes later, flanked by Dunbar and his associates. Mark Hadley came behind them, his hands in his pockets, not looking at anyone. Sylvia looked at Harlan across the space between them. For a moment, her face was without the calculation, without the performance, stripped to something underneath that might have been once the face of the girl who had sat on his shoulders and named cloud shapes on a summer afternoon. Then it closed again. She turned away. Boyd followed her. Colleen came behind them without looking up. Mark was last, and he did not look back at all. The three vehicles pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the road and were gone. Harlan did not know, standing there, that he would not see three of his four children again. He would learn over the following months certain things about what came after for them. Boyd faced charges for the break-in, and the process of facing them cost him what remained of the stability he'd been holding together with borrowed money and the assumption that his parents would always eventually be available to absorb the consequences of his choices. Sylvia and Mark Hadley's marriage did not survive. The combination of legal costs, the public exposure of the financial history, and whatever conversation they had in private after the courthouse. The conversation Harlan would never know the content of, did not want to know the content of, understood, was not his to know. Colleen sent an email 6 months later, 3 sentences, not asking for anything, just acknowledging in the imprecise language of a person who had never developed a vocabulary for direct accountability that she was sorry. He read it twice. He closed the laptop and did not reply. Not from cruelty, but from the understanding that some silences are not absence but boundary, and this one was both necessary and complete. He grieved the loss of them on the drive back up the mountain that afternoon, not loudly. In the particular way that grief works when it has been earned over a long period, rather than arriving suddenly, not as a sudden breaking, but as an acknowledgement of something already broken, the formal recognition of a state that had existed before the word for it was found. The foundation was Edna's idea first, though she gave him credit for the shape of it. They spent the winter planning. The evenings by the fire became working sessions, the kitchen table covered with notes in 2 different handwritings, Edna's precise and Harlan's angular, the same table where they had eaten breakfast every morning since arriving and where every important conversation of the last months had taken place. They talked the way they had always talked, through important things honestly, with room for disagreement, with the particular quality of attention that exists between 2 people who have been listening to each other long enough to understand what is being said beneath the words. They engaged Vera Stanton to manage the trust in the process of selective liquidation, selling pieces of the collection through private channels and established auction houses, always ensuring that provenance was clear and that destination was appropriate. The first sale, a single landscape through Christie's, generated $4.2 million. The next 3 first edition volumes, to a university library in Boston, generated $800,000. The process was not fast. It was not meant to be fast. Edgar had built his collection over 37 years, and spending it correctly would take years of its own. In the spring, Harlan drew plans for the first structure on the property. Not on the cabin. The cabin was Edgar's work and would remain Edgar's work, maintained, used, cared for, but not altered. He drew plans for a timber frame building on the eastern edge of the clearing, a structure that could serve multiple purposes: meeting space, counseling rooms, administrative offices for the work they intended to do. He drew it the way he had always approached new work, starting from function, working toward form, making sure the thing he was building would do correctly what it needed to do before he thought about how it looked. He hired 3 local contractors from Cedar Hollow. He showed them the drawings and talked through the details directly and without the kind of hierarchy that made tradespeople defensive. He worked alongside them most days because standing at a distance from work had never been his way. His hands still trembled. The tremor was lighter than it had been in Sylvia's garage. Either it had actually diminished through consistent use, or he had simply stopped measuring it, as carefully tracking it as an indicator of diminishment. He didn't think about it much anymore. He thought about the work. The Edgar Whitfield Foundation for Elder Justice opened its doors in August, 14 months after Harlan and Edna had arrived in Cedar Hollow on a Greyhound bus with 2 duffel bags and a toolbox. Its stated purpose was the provision of legal support, transitional housing, and financial guidance to elderly individuals who had experienced financial exploitation or abandonment by family members or caregivers. Its actual purpose was simpler than that, and Edna stated it on the day they opened, standing at the front door of the new building with a small crowd from Cedar Hollow looking on, to be what we needed when we needed it and didn't have. The first person to walk through the door was a 71-year-old woman named Margaret from Billings, whose adult son had taken power of attorney and drained her accounts over 18 months while telling her that the money was being invested on her behalf. She arrived in a rideshare car with one suitcase in the particular expression of someone who has been absorbing impact for so long that her face has rearranged itself around the damage not broken but shaped by it, the way wood is shaped by years of bearing weight. Edna met her at the door. She did not take her to a desk to fill out forms. She took her to the kitchen and made coffee and sat across the table and said, "Tell me what happened." And the woman told her. And Edna listened the way she had listened to patients for 37 years, not preparing responses while the person spoke, not organizing information into categories, just receiving what was being given, giving it the full weight of her attention, understanding that being heard was itself a form of care before any other kind of care was possible. By the end of an hour, something in the woman's face had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but released from the specific isolation of a person who has been carrying something alone and has finally found someone willing to carry part of it. Harlan observed this from the doorway. He thought about Edgar's journal. I watched Edna give care she was not given in return. He had given her something now to give again to people who needed it. That was the correct use of what they had been given. By the end of the first year, the foundation had helped 237 people. By the end of the second year, that number had grown to over 800. By the end of the third year, it exceeded 2,000. Lawyers were calling from other states asking how to replicate the legal framework. Social workers from agencies in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho were attending the foundation's training sessions. A bill before the Montana legislature used language that Mercer had drafted at Harlan and Edna's kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with a pot of decaf between them and a notepad between that. The collection continued to find its way into the world. A Bierstadt went to the Denver Art Museum, where it hung in a gallery that carried Edgar Whitfield's name beside the donor credit. A collection of rare books went to the Library of Congress. The Audubon prints went to a conservation institute in Pennsylvania. A Shakespeare folio went to a university in Virginia that had wanted one for 60 years. With each piece that left the vault, Harlan felt not loss but completion. Each object had been held long enough, cared for long enough, and was now going where it would be seen and learned from and argued about, which was exactly what Edgar had always intended for all of it. Leland came in the second autumn. He came without announcement, parked at the bottom of the mountain road and walked up. Harlan saw him coming through the trees from the porch, a figure moving uphill with the deliberate pace of a person carrying something in addition to their own weight. He was thinner than Harlan remembered, older in the eyes. He stood at the porch steps with the look of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say and has decided somewhere on the walk-up that the rehearsal was inadequate. He said he wasn't there for forgiveness. He said he understood he hadn't earned it and wasn't asking for it. He said he'd spent 14 months in counseling and that the counseling had done what it was supposed to do, had made him understand things about himself that he would have preferred to keep comfortable and unexamined. He said he understood now the difference between what his siblings had done and what he had failed to do, and that the failure to act was its own kind of participation. Then he set a box on the porch railing. Inside the box were 20 envelopes, each one contained a money order. Each one was dated 1 month apart going back 20 months, which meant he had been sending them to an account he had looked up himself before he'd made contact, before he'd had any assurance that the gesture would be received or even acknowledged. The total in the envelopes was exactly $20,000. Harlan looked at the box for a long moment. He looked at his son, thinner, older, standing at the bottom of the porch steps, without demanding anything, without performing anything, without asking for the particular absolution that people ask for when they apologize because they want to feel better, rather than because they understand what they did. Leland was not asking to feel better. He was standing in the consequences of his choices and accepting their weight. "Come inside," Harlan said. Edna made dinner. He did not embrace his son. He was not ready for that and would not pretend otherwise. But he held the door open and stepped back, and Leland walked through it, and that was a beginning. Not a restoration of what had been, because what had been was gone and could not be reconstructed, but something new built from different materials on cleared ground with the full knowledge of what the previous structure had failed to withstand. That was the nature of second chances. They were not repetitions. They were new constructions, built by people who knew better because they had lived through the consequences of knowing worse. Leland had dinner at the kitchen table. He met two of the foundation's staff members who were working late in the adjacent building. He walked through the small homes at the clearing's edge, where people were rebuilding lives that other people had tried to take from them. He said very little. He looked at everything carefully the way people look at things when they are trying to understand what they mean. When he left, he shook his father's hand, not because it was a natural thing, but because it was the correct thing, the right scale of gesture for where they actually were, rather than where sentiment might suggest they should be. On a Thursday in October, 5 years after they had arrived in Cedar Hollow, on a Greyhound bus, Harlan and Edna held the dedication ceremony for the Edgar Whitfield Memorial Garden on the foundation property. It was a quiet space, paths through native grasses and mountain wildflowers, benches at intervals placed where a person sitting on them would have a clear view of the eastern mountains. At the center, a stone monument. Harlan had chosen the stone himself from the creek bed on the western edge of the property, a flat-faced boulder of gray granite shaped by water over centuries into something that needed no additional work, that was already what it was supposed to be. On its face, cut by a stone carver from Helena, who had done the work for the cost of his materials, were Edgar's words from the letter the judge had read aloud in the Jefferson County Courthouse. In a world of takers, remain givers. In a time of greed, maintain integrity. Build something that outlasts you. More than 300 people came. Foundation clients who had been helped and had stayed in contact, some of whom had driven several hours because the ceremony meant something to them personally, because the foundation had been the thing that stood between them in a situation they might not have survived otherwise. Community members from Cedar Hollow and the surrounding county, lawyers and social workers who had joined the cause over the years, Sheriff Clem Bassett in dress uniform, Harriet Blaine from the library, who had written the complete history of the foundation in a bound document she'd produced without being asked and distributed without fanfare to everyone who attended. Harlan spoke last. He was not a natural public speaker. He had never been comfortable with the version of himself that existed in other people's attention, and 50 years of working in garages had not changed that. But he had something to say, and he said it plainly in the voice of a man who has thought carefully about what he means. He said, "A man I barely knew saw something in me that I had stopped being sure was still there. He didn't tell me about it. He didn't call me up and offer encouragement. He built something over 37 years and left me the key." He paused. What he left me was not the money. The money is a tool. What he left me was proof that a life lived with integrity builds something real, something that outlasts the person who built it, something that can be given to someone who needs it when they need it most. He believed that what I'd done with my life had value. He believed it for 20 years before I needed to believe it myself. He looked out over the gathered people, the mountains behind them, the timber frame building that housed the work they were doing, the small homes at the clearing's edge where people were rebuilding lives. "I spent 3 years believing that what I had built was gone," he said, "that the people I'd given it to had taken it beyond recovery, that I had spent 50 years of work on a house that had nothing left in it." He stopped, started again. "Turns out I was wrong," he said. "Turns out the thing I'd built that mattered was not in any account or any deed. It was visible to someone watching from a distance for 20 years, and he saw it clearly enough to stake everything he had on it. That's what I want you to take from today. Not the dollar amount, not the legal battles, not the story of how it worked out in the end. What I want you to take is this: what you are is visible, even when you think no one is watching, even when the world has given you every reason to believe that it doesn't matter. It is visible, and somewhere to someone, it matters in ways you cannot yet see." He stepped back. Edna cut the ribbon on the garden. They walked through it together afterward, the two of them at the pace that had become their pace over these years on the mountain, measured, attentive, taking the time that the ground deserved. The afternoon was warm for October, the kind of day that Montana occasionally offers in autumn, as if apologizing in advance for what winter intends to do. The mountains to the east were fully visible, their peaks carrying the first permanent snow of the season. They stopped at the stone monument. Harlan ran his hand across the cut letters. The granite was cold and solid and had the particular quality of stone that has been in one place for a long time and has no intention of going anywhere. "Do you think he knew," Edna said, "when he wrote the will, when he filed that letter with the court? Do you think he knew what we'd do with it?" Harlan looked at the mountains. He thought about Edgar in this clearing in the summer of 1953, 28 years old, living in a tent, while he built something by hand that he intended to last 100 years. He thought about Edgar returning to this vault every 5 years with a different colored pen to update his records, the same careful handwriting, the same deliberate mind, keeping its accounts honest across 3 decades of solitude. He thought about Edgar at a family gathering in Ohio in 1973, watching from the back of a room while Harlan held his brothers up and nobody held Harlan, and writing it down that night in a journal that would sit in a sealed vault for 50 years before anyone read it. I see how it ends. Someone should do something about that. I am beginning to think that someone is me. I think he hoped, Harlan said, and I think hoping was enough for him. He'd been right about most things for 40 years. He had learned to trust his judgment. Edna leaned against his shoulder. Above them, the October sky was the particular blue of high altitude and cold air, without cloud, without complication, doing nothing but being exactly what it was at this exact moment in this exact place. The pines at the clearing's edge moved in the afternoon wind, and the sound they made was the sound they had always made, unhurried and unchanged by any of the things that had happened beneath them. Harlan's right hand rested at his side. It was not trembling. He had not noticed exactly when the trembling had stopped. It had not been a single moment, but a process. The way most important things were processes rather than events. The gradual settling of a system that had found its correct operating conditions after a long period of running wrong. The trembling had been fairer when he sat on the floor of Sylvia's garage with his toolbox on his lap and nothing else. It had been there when he climbed out of Warren Fitch's truck in this clearing for the first time and looked at a cabin built by a man he barely knew. It had been there when he pressed vigorously against the 47th stone in a fireplace built by a man who had trusted him with everything he had. Now it was not there. He was 78 years old, his back curved from 4 decades over engines. His hair had been white for some time. He moved at the pace of a man who has learned the difference between speed and quality, who has understood that patience is not the absence of urgency, but its most effective application. By the end of the 5th year, the foundation had helped over 5,000 people. Laws had changed in 3 states as a direct result of cases the foundation had documented and advocated around. The foundation had funded a legal clinic in Billings, a transitional housing cooperative in Great Falls, a financial literacy program running in senior centers across 4 states. Mercer sat on the board. Harriet Blaine ran the foundation's archive and historical documentation. Leland had begun volunteering twice a month, driving clients to appointments, doing the work of someone who understands that trust is rebuilt through repeated small actions over a long period of time. The vault beneath the cabin held less than it had. Its contents were moving through the world in the ways Edgar had always intended to museums, where they could be seen to libraries, where they could be studied to foundations whose work could be sustained by their value. A Bierstadt hung in Denver, a folio sat in Virginia. The coins were distributed between 3 different university collections. Each piece that left carried Edgar's name with it, and each one performed in its new home exactly the function of something valuable that has found the right place. It made people stop and look and understand that beauty is not accidental. Harlan went down into the vault occasionally, not to inventory or to plan, but simply to be in the space. To stand in the room that Edgar had built by hand and kept for 37 years, that had waited in perfect patient darkness while the world above it went about its business. He stood there sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes longer, in the cool still air, and thought about the kind of faith it took to do what Edgar had done, to build something with no guarantee that the right person would come for it, and to wait anyway because the alternative was not building it at all, and not building it had been unacceptable. He always climbed the 12 stone steps back up to the cabin, carrying something he hadn't brought down. Not an object, something harder to name. The particular feeling of a man who has understood finally and completely what he was always supposed to be doing. On the porch of the cabin one evening in late October, with the foundation campus visible below and the mountains going dark above and the first stars beginning to appear, Harlan sat in the chair Edgar had built by hand and placed on this porch for exactly this purpose, to sit in at the end of a day and look at what was there. Edna brought coffee and sat in the chair beside him. They sat together in the way they had sat together for 53 years, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence between them had long since become its own form of language, a form that required no translation. Below them, lights were coming on in the foundation building. Someone was working late. In the small homes at the clearing's edge, other lights came on in sequence as the evening came down, each one a person doing the ordinary things of an ordinary evening in a place that had been built specifically so that they could do those things, cook a meal, sit down, not be afraid of the phone ringing. Harlan looked at his right hand resting on the arm of the chair. Still, completely still in the cold evening air. He thought, Edgar, you remarkable private patient man. You watched from a distance for 20 years and you were right about what you saw. You built something that lasted and you gave it to the right person and the right person tried to be worthy of it. He thought, I hope that was enough. I believe it was. I believe you would look at this mountain, at this clearing, at these lights coming on in the dark, and you would recognize the shape of what you intended. I believe you would set down your pen and close your journal and rest. You were right about almost everything, Edgar. You were right about me.